Hi, I'm Zana Fatima from IHP Sage Voices. Thank you for letting us interview you. Can you please introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jishnu Das. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Immunology at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. I also share a secondary affiliation with computational and systems biology, and I'm a part of the Center for Systems Immunology. So, what we do in my research group is to use systems approaches, computational systems approaches, machine learning, and network systems approaches to understand mechanisms of natural and vaccine mediated immunity across a range of immunological disorders.
Thank you so much. So the first question I have for you is how do vaccines work?
Uh, Thank you. So, I mean, this is obviously a very broad question, but I'll try to kind of boil it down into a simple explanation, and I'm happy to provide additional clarifications. So, the point of a vaccine is to essentially train the immune system to produce a response. Now, the response is of two broad kinds, what we call a humoral response, i.e., you produce antibodies, or you can have a cellular response, certain immune cells respond. Now, what a vaccine does is it trains our immune systems to respond to the pathogen should it encounter the pathogen. There are three broad ideas in terms of vaccines: protein based vaccines, mRNA based vaccines, and DNA vaccines. Till the recent mRNA vaccines for COVID 19, all the licensed vaccines were actually protein based vaccines. So, what happens in a protein based vaccine is there is this protein which is called an antigen. So, that represents some part of the pathogen. So, for example, it could represent a surface protein on the pathogen, and that would be in the vaccine. And once the body, so that's the only thing in the vaccine, along with there are other things to train the immune response, which I'm not getting into, they're called adjuvants. But once the immune system encounters that, it produces antibodies targeting that. So now your immune system is trained that if you actually encounter the pathogen, you can respond effectively. In an mRNA vaccine, which a lot of people are talking about now in the context of COVID 19, it's actually not a protein based antigen, but it's mRNA, messenger RNA. You can think of it almost as information encoding that antigen. So the cells would first express the protein, and then the body would mount an immune response against that. So, very broadly, it's training our immune systems to produce a humoral antibody response and a cellular response to effectively counter and neutralize the pathogen should it encounter the pathogen.
My next question is how much time passes before one can know if a vaccine is effective?
That's a great question. So I think when we think about effectiveness of a vaccine, there are several issues to consider. So three terms that are widely used are safety, immunogenicity, and efficacy. And efficacy could mean whether it's effective in the short term or in the long term. So effectiveness typically would refer to efficacy, but then there is short term as well as long lasting responses. So, to figure out how long a vaccine would be effective, so there are two parts to it. First, even before figuring out whether it's active, like actually effective, we need to figure out that it's safe and immunogenic. So that's what phase one and phase two vaccine trials are for, that there are no serious adverse reactions. And what immunogenic means is that it induces an appropriate immune response. Now, whether that immune response is effectively protecting you comes to the efficacy part. So that's what is assessed in a phase three trial. So, for example, in the context of COVID 19, you had these phase three trials for the Pfizer BioNTech and Moderna vaccines. And what the way these phase three trials are done, so most phase three, there's a separate kind of trial called controlled human infection trials. I'm not going to discuss them. Most phase three trials have a vaccine arm and a placebo arm. And what they do, so as in these trials, they let a certain number of people, so this is, let's say you have tens of thousands of people who are given the vaccine and tens of thousands of people who are not, so they are in the placebo arm. And then they go out and live their lives, and on natural course of their lives, some of them unfortunately get infected. Now what the phase 3 trial actually is looking at is the differential infection rates in the vaccine versus the placebo arm to measure how effective the vaccine is. So, for example, they have a primary endpoint saying that, okay, if in the placebo arm, i.e., people who did not receive the vaccine, let's say after a certain number of days, 100 people of the 10,000 that didn't receive the vaccine get infected, how many would get infected in the actual vaccine arm? Let's say it's 10. So then you say that, well, if you hadn't given them the vaccine, they had gone about and led their lives, 100 would have gotten infected, but only 10 of them, having received the vaccine, get infected. So the efficacy is 90%. There is a lot of matching of demographic parameters to make sure that this is statistically rigorous, the analysis. But what's more important is this is, you're looking at it at a time point shortly after giving the vaccine. So typically, antibody responses peak at around 2 weeks after giving the vaccine, and often you require multiple shots. So, for example, in the COVID-19 vaccines, they are talking about 2 shots around a month apart. However, this is effectiveness in the short term. It does not mean that the immune system would be trained to be effectively produce antibodies long term. That really depends on how well the immune system is trained and whether the immune system remembers well. So this is called memory. In some cases, it remembers very well. In others, it doesn't, which is why we need, for example, in flu, a flu shot every year.
My next question is, how can the public be assured that the vaccines that are being created for COVID-19 will be effective?
That's a great question, and that kind of goes back to these trials. So, for any vaccine to be approved and licensed, it has to go through rigorous rounds of trials. So, first is called preclinical testing, where actually, even before testing it on humans, in animal models, the vaccine is tested for efficacy. But once it passes preclinical testing, that okay, in animal models you have an effective vaccine, now you move to human clinical trials. And phase 1 is basically a small cohort of people where you make sure that it's safe. Then phase 2, you expand and you still see that it's safe and it's eliciting the immune response. And then once it passes all of this, it goes to phase 3, where on an even larger cohort, you are testing safety as well as efficacy. And as was in the news, for example, with the AstraZeneca vaccine or the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, whenever a serious adverse reaction occurs, the trial, the phase 3 trial, was actually halted. They made sure it wasn't due to the vaccine, and then it proceeded. And they rigorously track what are the side effects, are there serious side effects occurring. So before a vaccine is actually approved, all of this safety information is really carefully tracked. So although, like in the context of COVID-19, this is happening at a much faster speed than usual, we are not compromising on making sure that it's really safe and effective by going through these different rounds.
My next question is there a possibility of having side effects from the vaccine?
And the answer is yes, but these side effects are typically very minimal. So you have, for example, fatigue, fever, headache, minimal side effects. These are the common side effects. Even when you go to get your annual flu shot, they tell you about these common side effects that could happen. So vaccines do have side effects, but in the majority of cases, these are extremely minimal and they usually resolve with no intervention. Any vaccine that has been licensed and approved has made sure that in the vast majority of people, there are no to minimal side effects. Now, there could be slightly more serious side effects, but even that has been well studied. And then you can go to your doctor who can intervene and tell you what to do. But if there is beyond a threshold of adverse effects, the vaccine would never have been approved or licensed.
My next question is, how common is it to suffer from a serious injury due to a vaccine?
So this goes back to my previous answer, and this is extremely rare. And that's where the safety and rigorous scientific process that goes into these phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials really becomes important. So there are several regulatory agencies, and this is done on a per country basis. For example, in the US, the CDC and the FDA closely monitor, and each country has things that will monitor whether there are adverse side effects and reactions, and all of this information is tracked. So before the regulatory authorities in any given country sign off on a vaccine, this is really carefully monitored, which is why the number of serious adverse side effects is extremely minimal.
My next question is, what should one do if they suffer from any side effects, whether they are serious or not?
Again, great question. So once you get the vaccine, like whoever gives you the shot tells you that these are the common side effects. So, for example, headache or fever or fatigue, and if that's all you experience, that's fine. You don't really need to do anything about it. But like if you have anything more serious, like swelling more than normal, or let's say you have an allergic reaction, you should immediately contact your doctor, who would be able to advise you on the best course of action. Because again, doctors and clinicians are well trained that although it may not be very serious, it's gone beyond the threshold and they can intervene appropriately, and if necessary, monitor your progress.
My last question is, how is data on the side effects and failures of vaccines recorded? Who keeps track of this information?
That's again a great question. So, regulatory authorities in each country maintain this data. For example, in the United States, there is this vaccine adverse effect reporting system, VAERS, which is jointly maintained by the CDC and the FDA. So, all adverse effects are actually tracked, and regulatory authorities keep close tabs on this. So, as the vaccine keeps being administered to a larger population, it really tracks what the adverse side effects are. So there are really multiple checkpoints in place, like before licensure, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, and even after it's deployed in the general population, regulatory authorities are actually keeping close tabs to make sure that there are no serious adverse side effects.
So to clarify, there are three trials that are needed in order for a vaccine to be passed and used.
Yes, so there is preclinical testing, which is not like human trials. So even before the three trials, there is preclinical testing. So you would test whether the vaccine is effective in model organisms. So, for example, HIV vaccines are typically tested in non-human primates or monkeys. So after preclinical testing is completed, so it could be in one or more model organisms, so after it passes preclinical testing in model organisms, it is then in three broad phases of human clinical trials. So it's actually more than three.
Thank you so much. That concludes our interview.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for taking the time to do this for us.
Absolutely. Happy to. Thanks a lot for the invitation.
Thank you. If we need to contact you for follow-up, would that be okay?
Absolutely. Happy to follow up if necessary.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
You too. Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, so how do you feel?
Good.
What's the face?
I didn't realize I was muting too soon. I hope I didn't cut off too much.
No, and you did it with the one earlier too. I forgot to tell you. It's just that, and that's why he was finishing your sentences because you were cutting yourself off. But
Oh,
because we sent the questions in advance, they knew what you're going to ask. But be careful with that.
okay.
Okay, so like after you're done speaking, wait a couple seconds, then press mute.
Okay.
Okay. And your questions aren't going to be used anyway, so it's okay. They're not going to hear you asking the questions, so that's okay. But just for your person that you're interviewing, if they'd forgotten the questions, then it'd been like, what did you say?
Got it. Okay.
Okay. So how do you feel?
I feel good. I feel like they went well, the interviews that we did today. And yeah, I'm excited to write the script.
I'm glad. So I'm going to go ahead and close this now. So that way the video can process, and I'm going to add it to Google Classroom right now before I leave for work for the day. So you have access to everything.
Okay.
Okay. So you have a great weekend.
You too.
Good job, Zanab. I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of you.
Thank
This
you.
was amazing. You're welcome.
Bye, Mr.
Bye. Oh, have a, oh,